Hello, everyone. Huge thanks for joining us today as part of WERXFEST 25. My name is Elena Favretto, and I'm our Financial Services Industry Account Director over at Cloudwerx. And today I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. We're going to have a bit of a fireside chat around the transformation happening over at Bank of Sydney that we've been collaborating with Salesforce and obviously Bank of Sydney with over the last 9 to 12 months. Massive transformation there, not only around their digital ecosystem with Salesforce, but their larger core banking transformation program, which is a nice, I guess, complementary view of how these different tech stacks come together and deliver that experience. So in terms of who we've got in the room with us today, we've got Lindsay Duss from Salesforce, who's our account director, and Jeff Wemborn, who is the CIO over at Bank of Sydney. Lindsay, I might let you introduce yourself first, and then Jeff, just over to you and a bit of your background before we get into the transformation.
Sure thing. I was hoping you would. I always like to hear someone else's opinion of it. I'm Lindsay Duff. As Elena said, account director at Financial Services, or at Salesforce, sorry, in Financial Services. My background is actually I studied accounting and finance back in the States. I transferred with Ernst & Young across to Australia about 10 years ago. So I worked in our audit practice. I moved into consulting where I did performance improvement, kind of risk and compliance controls, and then, as I mentioned, process improvement. And at that point, I jumped across to Salesforce. So when I was looking at process improvement, I really wanted to look at kind of the full operating model and look at the kind of the tech side of it. So I moved across to Salesforce about 5 years ago, and I've been working in our financial services team since then. So I'm lucky enough to join, and I've got Bank of Sydney as a client. So over to you, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks, Elena, and I'm really glad to be here having this discussion. So yeah, Jeff Wemborn. I'm actually the COO, Elena, but don't worry about that. Historically, I've been CIO multiple times, I guess, along the journey, and in some bigger banks and smaller banks around Australia and other organisations, in fact, sort of leading that digital transformation journey. So it's quite exciting to be part of this one at Bank of Sydney. I've been in Bank of Sydney now for, I guess, getting close to 18 months. And it is a really significant digital transformation that is underway, but really critical for our future.
Thanks, Jeff. I think it'll be interesting I think when we get to it, also just hear about what it is that appealed to you, I guess, moving across to Bank of Sydney in the last 18 months to, I suppose, take on that transformation for them. But maybe just to set the scene first a little bit, I think it's always good to just ground ourselves in some of the trends that we're seeing in financial services, and I guess how that may have also played into what Bank of Sydney is looking at. So I guess, Lindsay, from your point of view and what Salesforce is seeing, what are those key trends that you're sort of seeing across that customer base now around their business strategy, their tech stacks, and how that's coming together in Salesforce is sort of helping around that?
Yeah. I guess question, are we looking at the customer side or employee or both?
Both.
Okay.
Wherever those drivers are.
I guess there's a couple I'll mention, and I won't go through these in too much detail, but I do find them quite interesting, and it very much aligns to some of these with Bank of Sydney. There's probably, I guess, two that I'll call out that aren't new, but they continue to stay at the forefront. We've always used the term hyper-personalization. I actually think of it more now as, I'll call it dynamic micro-personalization, where we're looking at leveraging, institutions are leveraging AI and analytics to tailor offerings. And it's beyond the broader segments, right? We used to look at things like age or region to more personalized, and that's actually based on behavior or life stage. So kind of more of the indicators in the background of, are they looking at retiring soon? What flags do we have? What behaviors have we seen? So in real time, that those personalization moments are happening, hence the dynamic nature of it. The other one, which very much relates to Bank of Sydney, is that omni-channel and seamless experience. Something that I find personally really interesting is the market forecasting that Australians will be free of cash, cards, passwords by, I think it's like 2030. And that's enabled by things like biometrics and passkeys. And where it comes into our space is around the idea of consolidated like super apps. So that really looks at financial institutions where they're looking at these seamless and very frictionless experiences where from a customer side, it's all very connected and seamless, but on the back end, you've really got to make sure that you've got your foundations and data in place to enable that seamlessness. So those are the two I want to call out as kind of not overly new, but very much at the forefront. The other ones that are very topical today, both from more on the customer side, is this idea of like purpose-driven employee, experience-centric offerings. And what I mean by that is really about emotions, right? The emotional connections. So higher income customers are valuing emotionally resonant, purpose-aligned experiences more over kind of quick transactional goods or deals. And so financial brands that we're seeing right now, especially in the financial space, are looking at shifting what they're offering around both their reward programs, offerings, rates, and services to make sure that they're emotionally compelling. And that really, really ties back into those life stages, behaviors, meeting them where they're at. So that one I find quite interesting now, and that's leveraging AI. So AI using that, we hear a lot about operational efficiencies, but this is really around meeting that customer service and tailoring to those kind of emotional behaviors. And then the last one, relevant to everyone, even outside of financial services, around fraud prevention. There's a lot now, huge focus on these instant digital services. And so you really need to be using AI and a lot of the tools now to be preemptive around preventative, not just detective. So those are kind of what I'm thinking. And the last around specific employee I want to mention is around upskilling. So Jeff, I'll be curious your opinion on this. Is upskilling looking for your employees actually, not just to do their day-to-day jobs, right? That you're actually looking to them to upskill around how to use AI and tools and more technology, because the operating models today are really shifting. So that's really what I'm saying. Anything from either of you guys would add?
I think the last comment on upscaling, that's really interesting, and probably ahead of where we are now, but people need to be curious about this and sort of get into it as soon as possible. So, and we're really looking for your help with that actually. So, definitely part of the journey.
Amazing.
Yeah, I was going to echo that. That's kind of a lot of the questions that we get from our customers is just that capability uplift that needs to happen around some of this tech as it goes in, because it's kind of one thing, getting the foundations right and being able to put the technology in, but how do you drive that adoption so you actually get the effects that, you sort of put out in your business case to begin with.
Yeah.
But I guess
completely.
over to you, Jeff, and the Bank of Sydney initiative and where that all started. What were those kind of main drivers that the bank was looking for around their transformation? What was, in terms of market trends, but also just the current state of the business? What were those things that you needed to go and very quickly transform?
Yeah, it's really interesting, when you think about how quickly the world changes. So, Bank of Sydney had been looking for a while about, what it needed to do, really just to get the foundations right, to be more competitive in a digital world. And sort of, even over the last couple of years, while that's been happening, there's sort of this, future wave of change, new payment rails, real-time payments, AI, generative AI, digital AI, etc. So, you just can't stand still. So really it was about the foundations first, and that for us is really around our banking and lending platforms, and our strategy was really, catch up and then keep up, because being smaller, just staying current with technology is a critical thing at the right unit cost. Like, what can we really afford? A lot of larger organizations spend a lot more money than we can, but there's no reason why we can't deploy some of the same technology and get the same sort of outcome. But we have to do that in a very careful way. So, what was central to us, we start with a very loyal customer base. We're very relationship driven, in a way, responding to Lindsay's earlier point around, there's a good emotional connection, but it's very a manually based connection with this bank. So, without uplifting our customer experience, our employer experience, really for sustainability, how do we grow? We really need to make sure that we develop those loyal customer relationships, but in a future sustainable way. So that's really more of a digital offering, clearly, because the next generation, like you guys, compared to me, have very different expectations of technology, and we need to compete in that market and attract those customers as well. So, we need to build that foundation. We need to build that foundation around the data that, Bank of Sydney can operate on and collect from our customers and work with them. And then also trust to underpin those relationships in what becomes a digital world. So having not invested, I wouldn't say there has been investment, but having not invested in a connected way, it was really bringing an enterprise view to how we actually created the platform for the future. That was sort of, I guess, overarching, and building the business case around doing that in a way where we create productivity and efficiency and really monetize the investment we commit to. So that's probably the key themes, I think.
Yeah. And then in terms of, I guess there's a quite a large transformation that you're doing in parallel between the core banking transformation that you're doing, and then I guess now bringing in Salesforce as that real engagement layer for you. Chat us through that sort of thinking to begin with around, I think a lot of people would look at that and say that's a lot of activity to undertake in a single year. Maybe we start with the core banking and wait for that to happen and then we address the next piece. So just curious for your thoughts on, running those things in parallel, the benefit for that, and then obviously as well, I guess some of the risks in that delivery that we can touch on a little bit later about how you try and manage, I guess, the volume of that work.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So we are undergoing or doing in parallel what would seem to be a very large change program. Because we do actually need to uplift our core transactional platform, so our banking and our lending. And strategically, what we need to do is move those to, a cloud-based mobile kind of model where we can consume those services from the partners who deliver them, at the rate of the market. So we need to move away from sort of, really lumpy sequential investments, because the world just doesn't work that way anymore. So that was a really interesting part of the discussions we had internally about, what is the technology we can really afford? And, my argument would be that we have to be competitive, so we have to be able to afford the same technology advantages as sort of bigger organizations, but we have to create that sort of experience layer and that customer outcome, at the same rate. So we can't wait 2 years and then, have a great customer experience, because we won't have enough customers and we won't sort of ever enable our growth objectives. So that was some of the thinking about, how we went around our plans. So we realized that, if we just delivered the core banking capability without sort of having the central view of customer, we'd have one half of the business going faster than the other half of the business, and we'd still have all the manual handoffs and trade-offs in the middle of all that. So, getting an enterprise view of customer rather than having customers split across multiple platforms was really critical. And to manage that, we've sort of, as you know, we've done that in a phase where we've kind of got a 3-year roadmap view of the journey. And, I would say if we're able to achieve that over 3 years, we'll be doing very, very well. But, in year one, we're really focused on building those foundations first.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point around that sort of sequential or pragmatic approach to how you chunk it down and deliver it over, potentially a number of years, but still make sure that there's some capability that you're delivering initially to support some of the ROI that you need from both the core banking transformation as well as, uplifting that engagement or digital layer that you might take to customers. I guess, Lindsay, obviously we co-developed it a lot with Jeff from the outset, but I guess in terms of how we went on that journey together and how it started, curious to kind of get your reflection on that and what worked well and the different roles that we played and how that came together to shape that roadmap and then, focus in on that year one
piece. Yeah. How can I give the full story? We okay?
Let's do it.
Full transparency. Okay. So about early last year, I met with Jeff, and like many customers, the question with Salesforce is, we've got this investment in Salesforce and it really doesn't feel like we're using the platform to its full capability, or even enough to warrant kind of an ROI on our investment. And we sat down, we had an honest conversation, and we said, okay, what if we actually just take a step back here? Coming from a consulting kind of angle was, why don't we actually just get to understand the business? It sounds a little bit like we're running in silos, right? We've got the contact center here, and that sounds like it's running, and it was implemented initially, but we've got, the ops teams and the branches and some other individuals in, the cards or processing teams who don't feel like they understand or have use of the system at all. So let's do, I think we initially set out of like a 3-month engagement. So what we did was we said, look, between the three of us, let's have a very open, transparent, communicative engagement. Let's work through this together to make the most of it, right? Jeff's always said, and I really took that on board, was you need to make the most of your vendors. You need to make the most of partnerships. So we did that. We set out, we had a lot of interviews. We interviewed, I think, every team across the organization. We did a recap with Cloudwerx and Salesforce side by side, and replayed those, and then got the leadership's team's opinion to say, look, this is what we need to. And something that we ended with, which was, I think, the strongest part of all, was a kind of an overview of this is the end vision of what the bank is wanting to do, right? What's that experience look like? How do we achieve a sustainable cost basis while growing our customers and growing kind of the revenue too? Is what does that look like? And so we set out and we said, look, let's be very clear and pragmatic about what does a foundation look like before we can. I think a lot of organizations will look at, let's use agents, without understanding underneath agentic AI sits metadata and processes, and underneath that is data that is clean and structured and unstructured, right? So unless you have a strategy around all these things, some of these tools can't be utilized to the capability we're looking at them doing. So we really took a step back together and said, okay, how do we sequence these things and really get clear on where the gap is? Let's focus on that and we'll achieve those together, because we need to make sure that we're, the ROI we're realizing from each of these projects is aligned to the business benefit. And then you've got the tail of adoption and change management after each program. So yeah, it was really interesting. It was really fulfilling after those interviews, because we could play it back and it was in the business's language, aligned to a business strategy, rather than what the tech can do. So yeah, Jeff, what was your opinion on that?
I think so. When we started, I suppose there was a view that we can't, Bank of Sydney can't do it on our own. This is why it's really important to have these conversations with the partners, because I think we had an internal team that was trying to build out some of the capability, but just can't compete. So, and pace is everything in the market. So we needed to sort of look at, well, how do we uplift the pace of return for our customer? And our staff, we're making decisions really quickly. It's obviously through that sort of customer engagement model. We realized we hadn't sort of rolled that out properly. And, the working group, our little working group, I guess, was looking at, well, how can we actually tie together what Salesforce can offer, leverage that fantastic capability, look at what Cloudwerx can do in terms of helping our small internal team to be able to deliver that, but do that within our envelope where we can afford to invest. And that's the hardest part in a way, a significant constraint, what we needed to do. So, we want to be, we're a small bank, but we want to really punch above our weight in terms of that ability, and that was through the partnership. So that's sort of a really critical part of how this thinking came around. And I think that was, as you said, Lindsay, one of the most rewarding aspects, that we were able to find a pathway where we fit the investment envelope, the timing envelope, and actually are able to sort of kickstart the program itself.
Can I add one thing, Jeff? Sorry, Lance, can I mention one other thing that I thought was really helpful? When it goes back to the other program, right? The core banking transformation, right? Running in parallel and being very aware of that is, throughout this journey, we were really clear about delineating not just what the core could do, but what should the core do versus what should Salesforce do, right? I think we get a lot stuck in what could this do, what could that do, but thinking about what is the customer experience, what is the employee experience, what does that engagement look like, behaviors, cases, questioning, servicing, relationships, versus the back end, the transactions, the financial management. And we were really clear as a team to say, this needs to sit here, this sits here, so that when we came up with the year one strategy, we could decipher what can we run in parallel without disturbing this core transformation program, without taking those resources. And there are dependencies between programs. So we were really clear on making sure that these two things could run in parallel. And we could only do that by working alongside your teams in the wider programs. The other thing we did was we looked at the other initiatives, right? It's not just Salesforce in isolation. It is, Nintex as a different software that we would build workflows in. What can we remove, decouple, or pull that work back? And actually that should sit here. So we couldn't achieve a business case that makes sense without looking at all enterprise initiatives and then taking that step back and saying, actually, this should sit here as well. So I think that was a pretty critical piece in making sure that this was an enterprise strategy.
Yeah, and Elena, before you jump in again, I just might want to. Sorry, I'll end up having a serial conversation with Lindsay if I'm not careful.
I mean, that's what the people want, so it's
No,
fine.
but this is really an inclusive statement for you as well. So, with the approach we took, so both Cloudwerx and Salesforce, working as our partners, made sure to get across the business and understand what the drivers were and what the priorities were, and taking into account that we needed to make sure that the core banking platform was not put at risk in any way by the fact we needed to get a better view of customers. So that whole approach really came together well. And I was going to mention that that it required a fair bit of governance internally with the Bank of Sydney team, because we had to work through multiple decisions to make sure that we called out the trade-offs for each of those, particularly should this happen in the core banking platform, or what about lending, or is this a capability that we need to adopt from Salesforce? And then how can we make sure that we proliferate this as an enterprise capability rather than one department versus another? So it has been a great sort of working relationship to get all those decisions made as we've tracked forward.
Yeah, I think my reflections on the whole process from the beginning to the end is that I think the very open, honest dialogue that we had with each other around where your priorities were and what your capacity were meant that we could make sure that we were supporting that appropriately and not kind of trying to do too much or overstep wherever it may be. And so the way we were able to build that 3-year roadmap made a lot more sense because we had that dialogue. And I think as a bit of context, for some of our listeners today, when we talk about that 3-year roadmap, it is that foundational layer of how do you just improve a lot of the workflows and that workflow management within the Bank of Sydney. So that's from everything around how you organise case management and the way in which you, I guess, collaborate as an internal team around those inquiries that you receive from customers. For Bank of Sydney, I think it was making sure that everyone was on the same platform and could collaborate to create some efficiency and automation there. It's improving the lead management process and making sure that as those leads come in from marketing, they're being converted over to those sales teams. And then, that third piece around kind of uplifting some of that marketing for the revenue generation side, and how do we improve some of those customer journeys from the outset, both to bring in those new customers, but ensure that you're retaining those ones that, might get to their maturities and so forth. And so it was, let's build those foundations and then from there uplift in the subsequent years into a more digital self-service experience through portals for customers, but also brokers. And then, into the future, it might be more efficiencies out of things like agents. And I think, that constant feedback from your team around, this is what's possible and this is what we can take on meant that we could sequence that into a space that meant it was feasible for the project to move ahead, which was quite important, I think. I guess one of the reflections that I had as well was, that core banking transformation. One of the other things that we looked at in that foundational stage was how do we help support that and how do we help accelerate some of that? And I think that's where some of the services like integration sort of starts to come into mind. If you've got something like a core banking platform and Salesforce and how do those things come together? I think some of that decision making around what does your wider architecture as a bank look like, and that was being conscious as well that you had other platforms like Snowflake and others that you were using to support that system. So sort of curious, Jeff, when you're trying to look at how do you bring all these things together, just your thought process there and potentially kind of what led you to the integration strategy that you had in place, I guess in the hopes that it was going to accelerate what you're doing around the core banking transformation as well.
Yeah, I think that was a really key part of it as well. And that whole, I think as I mentioned earlier, like there has been, it's not that Bank of Sydney's never invested in technology, But part of the problem is that the pathway of investment hasn't really connected the experience for employee or customer. And that's where the integration layer became a really key part of what's offered by Salesforce through MuleSoft. But then also, having Cloudwerx as our partner to make sure that that integration built for our core banking will actually then be reused through lending and all the other connections we need to make. So that's an absolutely critical part of what we're trying to deliver. But sort of going back a step from there, most organizations have multiple technology stacks and multiple technology partners. And my view is to try and make sure that you have a handful, because you need to be able to spend time in any vendor relationship to get the best from them. So, sort of to me, many best of breed kind of services don't really work, and particularly won't work without that sort of connectivity layer that we just spoke about, integration being in place. But the partner needs to be able to work the way you work. And I think, I might be jumping ahead here, but just thinking through, as we sort of embarked upon our Salesforce implementation with Cloudwerx, our organization had never really experienced an agile style of way of working previously. Um, in early days that was a bit bumpy.
Teething.
It was hard to get the business aligned to, you mean what? So, but I would reflect that we've moved through that, and this is what a partnership does. If you have an open dialogue with the right partner, so early on our project was probably quite red, but lately it's moved to green as we've all managed to figure the pathway. And in fact, I think Elena, this will be great news, but just yesterday at our executive meeting, Moas from Cloudwerx was called out for the great work he's done on sort of helping us
Yes.
with one of the sort of process glitches that we ran into, where we thought we were going to use all things vanilla, but we needed some changes to the model. So I think that's what the partnership's about, and I keep saying that word because I think that's the most important thing about delivering technology the best way.
Yeah. And I think that sentiment's so true. And I think it is also that collaborative delivery across the three. Again, I think it hasn't been, once we've moved to implementation, that it's sort of become the Bank of Sydney and more Cloudwerx show. I think Lindsay and the Salesforce team, obviously we have our steerco and we're sort of jointly, consistently jumping across where is the project at, where does it need support, because Lindsay's able to provide that from a Salesforce side as well. Which I think has sort of helped things kind of run a lot more smoothly. And yeah, Jeff, you sort of moved the conversation to, I guess, one of the final areas that we're hoping to talk about, which is just how that delivery has gone and what that experience has been like. And to your point, was conscious that the Bank of Sydney team, it was a large piece of work, and moving to Agile is a very different system, and it can be sometimes, projects. We can move more quickly sometimes than I think customers can. And so it's how do you make sure that you're balancing the speed of the delivery with the ability for the business to go back and kind of make some of those key process decisions more than anything else that's going to align the rest of the tech. And yeah, to your point, I think that there's a bit of teething at the start, but now you can see the Bank of Sydney team in rhythm with that. And I think it's things like those showcases, I think, where you've got teams that when you sort of talk about what process is and you talk about the tech, it's hard to imagine what it looks like. And I think that's just one of the key things in the delivery that helps show back to the business what things look like, so that you can make those tweaks on the fly before it's too late. That's kind of probably helped a lot of that process as well. But yeah, was kind of keen around any other observations that you'd had around the project, or any other constraints that were important in your mind around trying to manage. And I guess Lindsay as well, from your point of view, sort of sitting across a few different customers that have gone through these implementations, where those things work well and what those gotchas are for, I guess, maybe some of our listeners that are thinking around going down the same path.
Yeah, so just sort of keeping it going on the partnership theme for a moment. So Lindsay's still one of our most sought after speakers at the Leadership Forum. I think that experience of sort of having the vendor engaged across your whole leadership group and understanding, what might be possible. And as you suggested just then, Elena, the showcase process has actually worked really well for our senior executives to understand, the technology can seem really abstract if you've only experienced it one way and an organization hasn't really not very mature. Whereas, when you can see that technology evolving, it becomes sort of much more real. But I just want to sort of comment, I suppose, on, how success is realized, because most organizations have been in some sort of digital transformation for a long, long while. We're a bit unique in the fact we really haven't been. But any activity that requires lots of people and lots of vendors in particular to work together over a long period of time really requires great teamwork. And the best way to enable this is really to have, alignment. And you need that alignment to get people leaning in, and that needs to be the same vision, strategy, and objectives, and sharing that across a team sounds simple and always is at the beginning, but over time there's always disruption. So, to overcome that, you really need very strong sponsorship and support. And I talk about that sort of in two ways. So that's one way is through, our own leadership inside the bank, which has been fantastic because recognizing here's our critical path to deliver all this. But then you need the right support, right up through the board, but across your vendor sort of engagement and relationships as well. So I kind of, to come back on that theme, people will talk about, oh, well, how do you really enable a successful digital transformation? It's about the people, the process, or the technology. And we kind of know it's all those things really, but ultimately it's alignment and sponsorship through the whole journey. So, I'm really looking forward to the day, Lindsay, you come back and do the showcase when we've got everything sort of singing and dancing. And look, that's still, we've still got a way to go. So I'm not declaring victory at the moment because, to get the full value of what we're doing here will take, probably another 12 to 18 months. But it's an exciting journey, and even if it's challenging along the way.
Yeah, can I jump in?
I was going to say,
Okay.
Lindsay,
Yeah,
the closing
you can
comments
tell
or
when I do
thoughts from
this.
you, please do.
I've got a few comments. Yeah, Jeff, when you said alignment and the executive alignment, one thing that really stood out to me across customers in my space is that from the outset, Milos, who's the CEO, you've got Victor, who's the CFO, Kieran, who's the Chief Risk Officer, people are involved, Maria, marketing. The team is interested and wants to know. It is not operations, the COO or the CTO or
Don't forget Diane Credit. Don't forget Diane Credit.
Oh, Diana was.
She's fantastic. So.
She, I think by the end she was ready to stop answering our calls, but she was fantastic, and she contributed a significant amount of intel around the bank. Here's how we operate. Here's our customer base, which was really interesting because as a chief credit officer, sometimes they aren't involved, right? That they receive the back end output of a project like this rather than having the upfront input. So to have that type of guidance and input upfront, not just to hear the outcome and have a final stamp or decision, they were involved in guiding this is what we want to see. This is the vision. And I think oftentimes everyone's busy, but oftentimes that can be missed until the end. And then the frustration comes because the expectations and the vision aren't aligned from the beginning. And this was a unique case and a really incredible case of everyone coming and saying, I will spend the time. We prepared, we worked hard, but that was really unique and incredible. So I'd say that was really a standout kind of learning from me. The other one was the empowerment, which I'll say from a Salesforce side is, I think sometimes we hear from customers, well, we don't know what we don't know, right? And you kind of go, I guess I kind of get what you're saying, but this one was really a learning lesson for me around the mindset at Bank of Sydney between the three of us through this has changed from what I, as an observer, will call a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, right? It was previously, we haven't had any significant transformation in the way we operate in, I don't know, Jeff, maybe 10 years. And you've got people who stick around and they've been employees for 15, 20 years, which is incredible tenure. But there's a change risk, right? When it comes to programs like this. So to work through this and work through a partnership and continuously let people ask questions, guide them through what's possible, and not overly always blue sky thinking. You've got to balance what's tangible and pragmatic as an approach, but also what if you did do it differently and get their opinion on this? You could feel over the 12 months, 18 months now, they're coming to us. Jace, the head of architecture comes to us, the program managers say, hey, we just thought of this. Is this possible? Could we have a conversation around that? And that growth mindset really allows them to utilize as a bigger bank, a strategic platform, as opposed to, niche solutions that don't enable that pathway. So
Yeah, I
that
think
was it.
it just, sort of reflecting on that a little, again, going back to the process, recognizing we're not done, but that showcase process, it's moved from a push to a pull. And that's a really big issue for our organization because, as you said, we've got lots of people who've, been really loyal to this bank and have done the same thing the same way a long while. But now there's that real sort of thirst to say, well, how can we do it differently? And, I'd call out Hugh as well in the retail team for the same. They're just so excited about what they can see in those showcases. They sort of can't wait. So I think we've sort of achieved that dynamic of moving it from, here's some change, deal with it, to actually give us more change because we really want to make the most of it. So that's a really good achievement as well.
I think the other sort of additional reflection that I make on that too is just the way in which these programs can, I guess, bring the business together and almost kind of facilitate how those teams come together. I know when we started, and Jeff, I think when you first came into the Bank of Sydney, it was a little bit more siloed around the distinct divisions, and you sort of came in with that enterprise-wide view that says we all need to come together and work at that enterprise level and with that enterprise tech stack. And I think through a lot of that, I guess our design and discovery process, meeting with each of the teams, but then bringing them together around this is a process that needs to work across all of you. And, I think all of that sort of helped transform how they collaborated together, but also kind of that view of, oh, this is actually how the technology also brings us together and kind of makes that more seamless. So that was quite, I think it's been one of my most favorite things to watch almost, I guess, through the process is just that coming together. And then to Lindsay's point, how it's, moved from that kind of fixed mindset into the, well, what can we do next? And generally the question seems to be how quickly can we get there now, which is great. Obviously a bit of execution in the way of, that needs to get in place there first. But yeah, that enthusiasm and optimism is great.
Absolutely.
Well, I think unless anyone's got any other sort of closing comments that they want to make around the transformation, hopefully that's been super insightful for everyone that's joined today. And I think I'm going to offer this out to everyone on your behalf, guys. But if anyone's sort of watching this and they've got any questions and would love to sort of have a chat with Jeff to understand more, or Lindsay or myself, please reach out through our channels and we'll help set that up. But it's been a delight, I guess, for us to sit here and reflect on everything that we've done together in that program. And really thank you guys for your time and in putting that in for WERXFEST 25.
Thanks, Elena. It's a pleasure.
Very happy.
Great host.
Very happy to. The brains trust we proud of this partnership. So thanks, Elena. Thanks for having us, and thanks to Cloudwerx and WERXFEST. So I'm excited to attend the other sessions.